Throughout recent history, the nations have been warned by a few vigilant men about a great conspiracy against them. Since the time of Christ and his apostles, the nations have been warned of the dangers of the so-called Jews, about their malevolent and rebellious spirit, about their growing wealth and power. Unfortunately, the most recent generations have not been as vigilant to the dangers. In earlier times, the Jews had been correctly identified as a foreign adversarial entity among the Christian peoples. The nations understood the importance of being masters of their own houses. They understood that a guest may only have privileges within the house he visits, and that the host reserves the right to revoke and expel a guest should he overstay his welcome. This, however, has changed in recent times, for the Jews were able to buy up the newspapers and take control of the press and other propaganda media. Due to the poisonous philosophies of the so-called Enlightenment era, the Christian nations became weakened and allowed materialistic and vain pursuits of conquest and empire to drive them away from the teachings of love and peace among brethren as Christ taught. They came to be in constant conflict and war, between the English and the Germans, between the Germans and the French, between the English and the Boers in South Africa. These unfortunate conflicts between Christian brethren, be they Germanics or Slavics or Romanics, drove the Christian world into a state of decay. The nations did not understand the weaknesses that were gradually being exposed, but international Judea most certainly did notice. The latter half of the 19th century saw not only the acquisition of mass media by the Jews, but also the nearly simultaneous birth of a long-term, murderous, two-sided conspiracy designed to exploit those very same weaknesses and turn them against the nations of the world. Those two sides of the conspiracy were Zionism and Marxism. Some Jews went with one side, some with the other, but both were a deadly dialectic for the nations. The Marxists issued their Communist Manifesto as far back as the middle of the 19th century, but it would be another 50 years before they were able to have much of an impact on the Christian world. As for the Zionists, they too began propagandizing and organizing around the same time. However, they only began to come to prominence as a power at the beginning of the turn of the century, when they began having international Zionist conferences and more or less openly laying out their plans to incite wars and revolutions of which they could take advantage to promote Jewish interests. For example, at the World Zionist Congress in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland, the Zionist leader Theodor Herzl told his fellow Jews that they were having trouble persuading the Turks, who at the time controlled Palestine, to turn the country over to them, but that the Jewish leaders had plans in the works already at getting around the Turks. Herzl said, quote, "It may be that Turkey will refuse us or will be unable to understand us. This will not discourage us. We will seek other means to accomplish our end. The Orient question is now a question of the day. Sooner or later, it will bring about a conflict among the nations. The great European war must come. With my watch in hand do I await this terrible moment. After the great European war is ended, the peace conference will assemble. We must be ready for that time." End quote. Herzl was speaking of Jewish plans 17 years before the outbreak of the First World War. As they had planned, the Jews were ready when the war finally came. In 1916, with the war favoring a decisive victory for the non-aggressor Germany, international Judea, including Jews in Germany, approached Britain's political leaders and made a deal to bring the United States into the war on the side of Britain in exchange for a British promise to take Palestine away from the Turks and turn it over to the Jews after the war. Just as Wilson had done 24 years earlier, Roosevelt ran for re-election in 1940 on a campaign promise to keep the United States out of the war in Europe. And while he was lying to the American people with false promises, he was actively scheming with his Jewish advisors and supporters to get the United States into the war as soon as he could. To keep the war in Europe going, he also made promises of support to all countries that were opposed to Germany. World War I ended with the Treaty of Versailles when Germany was wrongly blamed for the war and had territories redistributed. They did, however, declare war on Germany, because Germany, through Hitler, had freed itself from the grip of international Judea and had freed the German media, German education, German finance, German politics, and German culture from Jewish influence, and was in the process of removing all subverters out of German life. That was the reason for the Second World War, not Polish freedom or Polish territorial integrity. That was the reason why, when in April of 1943, the German Wehrmacht discovered the mass graves of some of the 25,000 Polish officers and intellectuals murdered by Jewish communists, and invited the International Red Cross and journalists from many nations to investigate and view the evidence, the controlled media in Britain and in the United States ignored the evidence and blamed the atrocities on the Germans. That was the reason as to why, at the end of the war, those countries who had gone to war to supposedly ensure the freedom of Poland agreed to turn Poland, Latvia, Hungary, and the rest of Eastern Europe over to the communist butchers who had carried out the massacres of the elites of the Polish nation, which the Germans were trying to war. Europe, whose Jews were supposedly
holocausted by Hitler.
Suffering under the tyranny of the Jewish victory of World War II, there were tens of millions of Hungarians, Poles, Latvians, Serbs, and other Eastern Europeans suffering under the yoke of communism who wished that the Germans had won the war and ended the tyranny of Bolshevism. These communist Jews were so hated by the Eastern Europeans they ruled over and exploited that there was constant turmoil. After the Hungarian uprising of 1956, many of the leading communist Jews were replaced by treacherous non-Jew frontmen, while the Jews continued to exploit the people from behind the curtains. Even as the communist regimes of Eastern Europe began collapsing during the past few decades and their economies began to be privatized, Jews continued to plunder the people among whom they lived. Using money from their brethren abroad through their vast network of synagogues, Masonic lodges, private charities, NGOs, and even foreign policies through their strong influences in governments, they managed to buy up the most valuable factories, mines, and other national resources at fire sale prices, and then milk them for all that they were worth. It was fighting on the wrong side of that world war, more than anything else, which doomed the Christian nations of the world under the tyranny of international Judea. There was a moral and spiritual collapse of the Christian world. It wasn't just the German people who lost the World War. It was all of Christian Europe, and in fact, all nations and races of the world that are today victimized by international Judea, including Americans. The Jews were the only real winners of the war. The First World War resulted in the acquisition of Palestine for their Zionist faction and delivering Russia to their communist faction. The Second World War not only spread their agendas for world conquest in the face of an awakened Germany, but it also delivered all of Eastern Europe and much of Central Europe to their communist faction and finished delivering Palestine to their Zionist faction. The war costed them but a few 100,000 of their nimble lesser Jews in Europe, but gave them in return the basis for their enormously profitable Holocaust narrative propaganda with which they have beaten the nations over the head with ever since.